Every piece of artwork means something. Whether it is a simple art piece that you encounter on a walk, such as Starboard by Rachel Joynt, or the spire of Dublin that is so tall it can be seen from quite a ways away, or the pictures created by local artists showing their connections to their land. Each of these pieces has a purpose and a connection to the history of the area it represents. The Irish are a group of people who love to tell stories, and from what I learned in my time in Ireland, they definitely have many stories to tell. These stories can be told through the many public art pieces that are displayed throughout Ireland. For this project, I'm going to take a closer look at some of the public art that I found the most interesting throughout Ireland and compare and contrast it to what I learned in the museums and on tours, as well as to poems, fiction, and non-fiction that I have read. I really think the public art of Ireland can tell someone so much about the history of the place that it is located, and the stories of the people who live there if they are willing to dig a little deeper. On the Black Taxi tours, one of the guides stated that the murals are political statements. They symbolize a way of life today and famous battles of the past. Murals are drawn to represent the people who drew them and the struggles that they have been through. They are meant to help gain support from the people around them and to tell the stories of certain communities and their struggles. In The War of the Walls, Political Murals in Northern Ireland, Bill Ralston talks about how the images of the Loyalist murals changed throughout the years depending on the conflict. This plays into the storytelling of the Irish. The murals were used to show identity, beliefs, and values. For example, the Protestants are proud to be part of Britain, and that is shown with the symbols that they incorporate into their murals. The murals were also used to portray to outsiders who was in charge of certain areas. Ralston states, whichever group controlled an area festooned the walls with murals of armed men, part self-adulation, part an attempt at reassertion for local population that the paramilitary groups concerned would defend them from the IRA. The walls were created to show pride and confidence in those in charge, and to give the people in the area something to believe in. I think that by doing this, the people were also giving more power to those in charge, because they were making it very clear who controlled the area. Again, these murals show the beliefs of the area, but they also created more division. Today, the murals are used more to create a sense of community as well as to tell the stories of the past. Ralston states that this has been done by creating more murals of King Billy, as well as painting local heroes onto the murals. People who once lived in the community and are looked up to. It creates a sense of pride within the neighborhood towards this person, and it also brings those living there together. It gives them something to bond over and something to share their love for. History is also shown in the Republican murals. For example, the mural of Bobby Sands. This mural tells the story of a hero from the past who was brave and fought hard for what he believed was right. In the past, many Republican murals were used to draw support for their causes, such as the hunger strike. Through murals, stories would be told about certain events, and through the way the events and the people were depicted, the Republicans hoped that they would be able to gain support. For example, the hunger strikers were shown as heroes and victorious, beating the British. They showed confidence in those involved and hoped that by showing their strength and bravery, others would join in and support the cause. The Republicans also incorporated symbols which had deep-rooted meaning to them and their identity on their murals. For example, the phoenix and the harp that can be found on the Bobby Sands mural. This showed their connection to their Irish identity and the strength that they drew from it. Through Ralston's essay, one can see just how important the murals were to the wars in the North. They told the stories of the time, and as the stories changed, so did the murals. Today, the murals are symbols of the past. They are used to bring communities together and to show pride in those that have fought on their side. They are a way for a community to show their strengths as well as their beliefs in a non-violent manner. The Big Fish statue in Belfast was created using ceramic tiles as the scales of the fish. Each tile is decorated with different newspaper clippings, images, and other art mediums that tell the story of Belfast history. The fish incorporates both visual and print art within itself. We hear the story that went along with the fish and how the great salmon brought all the knowledge of the world to Fionn. I think that this statue is meant to mimic this story. All the images that have been placed on this great fish are meant to bring a great amount of knowledge of about Belfast to those who see it. According to Tim Hall, public art programs will tell us what heritage is valued, what aspects of the history of the city are selectively remembered, celebrated, and incorporated into prevailing art narratives of civic identity. I thought that this was a perfect quote to describe the big fish. Everything that was placed on the scales of the big fish was chosen, so each scale must be full of meaning to those of Belfast. They specifically choose what they wanted to remember and what they wanted others to know. The fish incorporates everything that those in Belfast feel have made Belfast what it is today. This knowledge can be important to the people because it tells about the past and explains what happened, which helps people to understand the present, as well as be able to make changes for the future. You cannot try and change something if you do not understand the problem. The Big Fish is an art piece that uses two mediums to tell the story of Belfast so that those who see it are filled with knowledge about the great history. In one of my journals, I discussed how I thought many artists try to make women look ridiculous to prove a point. And although I still think that this is done, I also think that these women who the artists create to be amusing are stuck, and that's the point. They cannot do anything about their situation and how they are seen in society. And often society sees these women and their roles as being amusing and comedic. This is shown in the statue by Louise Walsh called Monument to Unknown Women Workers. Walsh has placed many different objects on them that a woman is thought to use, such as a bowl, a spatula, clothes hangers, and a telephone. The statue tells the story of how women used to be seen and how many still are seen in society today. As I have mentioned, the Irish Constitution once stated that the state shall therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home. This statute shows women in the role of a housewife. It does not allow them to be seen as anything else. This doesn't make the women look amusing, but it shows that how they are thought of in society, and how these objects and these roles are literally stuck to them. There is no escaping this identity. This is the same feeling I got when I read The Woman Turned Herself into a Fish by Evan Boland. A woman transforming herself into a fish is a comical image, but if you really read the poem, you see that the woman feels stuck. Boland uses one-word lines to get this point across. An example is her use of the word screamlessly. The woman is a fish. She does not have a voice. She cannot speak out against her situation or being oppressed. She is stuck and she is silent. I think that this line describes the women in Ireland in general. Although they fought so hard for the freedom of their country, they were not given a voice. In the end, they were oppressed by the Constitution, and they could not speak out against it. It clips in these hips, in these loins, hipless, and I am sexless. These lines describe the woman no longer being able to give birth like mammals do. I thought it was interesting that this came towards the end of the poem, as if now that she can no longer perform this task and the transformation is complete, she has become as useless as a fish. She must simply learn to lay eggs, but again, she is dependent on a male to fertilize them. Through this poem, we can see how comical it is to turn a woman into a fish, but we can also see that in many ways they can be compared to fish because they are voiceless and dependent. Both the woman in the sculpture and the woman in the poem can be seen as being trapped. They are seen in one way, and this is the only way that they are seen. It becomes permanent and fixed. Both images are amusing but very sad. It really shows the oppression of women in Ireland. I found that the famine was one of the events that was written about the most in all forms of print art. This is because it was such a dramatic event that really changed Ireland forever. It affected every single person living in Ireland, the rich and the poor. The statue truly depicts the harshness of the situation. It does not soften the experience. Every detail of it is heartbreaking. The skeletons are so thin and twisted into the most awful positions. The expressions on the dead's face are heart-wrenching. They are so empty, yet full of pain and sadness all at once. The fact that there are so many of them wrapped up on this boat adds to the sadness and shows just how heavy the situation was. The boat itself is eerie. It too also resembles a skeleton. It was as dead as those who were on it. There are poles but no masts, indicating that the ship was not really going anywhere. The people on it were trapped. They were dead from the start. No mast means there is no hope. Sad and bleak looking. This awful feeling of sadness and no hope is carried on in the poem by Alana O'Kelly that was written on her artwork in the Crawford Gallery. This poem shows just as much hopelessness as the sculptures did. The final lines of the poem are, "She made one last effort to stay alive. Diverting her eyes from his face, she came to his bare feet. She proceeded to eat them." This line instills in the reader the same emotions as that of the memorial. Complete sadness and misery for those who suffered in the tragic event. To have no other option but to eat your own child's feet brings the same amount of hopelessness to one as does the ship full of skeletons. Another poem that I read at the Famine Museum that gave me the same feeling was edited by Christopher Marish. After reading his poem, the museum also had a plaque about the soup, how the soup was truly useless and had no nutritional value in it. One doctor said that it was actually injurious to those who were suffering from dysentery. With lines in the poem such as, "If you chance to get in, and by steam he fed thousands, I'm sure every day," and "The impatient mob sure they shoved in the rails," the reader envisions thousands of starving people waiting, trying desperately to eat this soup that ironically does nothing for them. This again gives one the sense of hopelessness and complete sadness for these people. These are simply a few examples of the thousands of stories that were told about the famine. This is a story told by the Irish through their art because it was a major event and the story needs to be told. People need to know what happened to them. Both the boat and the two poems show their audience how helpless and hopeless Ireland and its people were. From the orientation walk given by Andrew, I felt that the city of Cork was its own art piece. The architecture and the layout of the city tells the story of the history of Cork. Andrew said that Cork was a city of people and stories, and that the history of the city could be traced through the layout. There is no planned layout, but over the years, the city grew based on the economics and invasion. This is seen in the different era in which the buildings on the same street belong to. On one of the streets in Cork, there is a mixture of old and new buildings. That was due to the Black and Tans coming into Cork and burning down all the buildings that they could. The economic changes within Cork can also be seen within the city's layout and architecture. As Andrew mentioned, you can see how much economy has changed in Cork over the last 50 years because many more roads have been built within the city. Through the way that Andrew talked about the city on the walk, you could really tell that he truly loved and admired the stories of Cork and the way the city came to be. You could see that Cork had had an impact on him. The same love was shown through the poem that he read us by Cole Creedon, entitled Follow Your Nose. It was about growing up in Cork in the 50s, and through it one could see a sense of love that Creedon had for the city. I love how the layout of the city can tell its own story. It is its own artwork, and I do not think that it was just the city of Cork that did this. The layout of the city of Derry and Belfast, I think, did much of the same. The walls that stand today mark the separation of the religious groups and tell the story of the city's past. In Derry, the wall tells the story of division between the Protestants and the Catholics and how they used to live in this city. It also tells the story of the apprenticeship boys. The layout of Belfast does the same thing. The piece of wall and the placement of the Protestant and Catholics around it show the history of division that exists and has existed in the city for many years. In the excerpt from Cathal O'Byrne's As I Roved Out in Belfast and Districts, O'Byrne's discussed how many of the streets in Belfast were named, and just like in Cork, there is a history to their names. According to this excerpt, Arthur was a favorite name in Donegal family, so there is an Arthur Street, an Arthur Lane, and an Arthur Place. And Castle Place, Castle Market, and Castle Street were so called because of their proximity to old castles of Belfast. Through the words that O'Byrne chooses, I felt a certain negative tone in this piece of writing. He gives off a sense of anger and resentment when he talks about the renaming of the streets. For example, from its earliest hour, the town seems to have suffered from, to use this jargon of the moment, an incurable inferiority complex. Belfast has always dearly loved a lord, a foreign one, of course. And Marsh Street, Quay Street, Store Lane, Wayhouse Lane, Forest Lane, Back Lane, Mitchell's Entry, and Bluebell Entry have all been cleared away to make room for Victoria Street and Albert Square. Through this language, you can see that O'Byrne does not agree with Belfast's love for foreign lords. It shows off the side he stands for, and again brings to light the division that exists within Belfast, and how the architecture and the street names within the city can show so much history. This is something that I also spotted on the Black Taxi tours. On the Protestant side of the walls, the street names were simply in English, but on the Catholic side, they were in Gaelic and English. Again, this shows how the layout and the small details within the city all have a story to tell about the past and the events that have led up and created the city as it stands today. Statues such as the Hands Across the Divide by Maurice Heron and Thanksgiving statue created by Andy Scott represented the division in Ireland and the hope that the Irish have for the future. In an excerpt from Brendan Kennelly's Journey into Joy, Selected Prose, Kennelly states that there are certain words in Ireland that glint, quiver, and stick in people's minds, like the thin blades of knives. Partition is one of these such words. Within Ireland, there's a lot of division. There is division between the Irish and the English, the Protestants and the Catholics, the anti-treaty and the pro-treaty, the loyalists and the nationalists, and so on. I think that statues such as these were erected to show that these issues are still prevalent today, but also to try and show that it can change, and in the future these divisions can be reconciled. In the Hands Across the Divide statue, the boys' hands are not quite touching. This shows that they have not reconciled their differences, but there is still hope that one day they will be able to join hands. Kennelly asked the question, can an Irish poet escape being labelled? He talks about how many of the poets, such as Seamus Heaney, show their labels through their poetry even if they try and stay unattached. Through Kennelly's words, I felt the same as I did when I saw the statues, that these issues, this division, and the labels that have been placed throughout Ireland and on its people are so deeply set within society that it is very hard for anybody to escape it. Kennelly goes on to talk about how the poems about the North are powerful and they force you to think, and they are not all direct. Violence sweeps into their poems. The poetry emerging from any city is an acute guide to the tolerance of the city's people. Seamus Heaney's poem, Whatever You Say, Say Nothing, is an excellent example of a poem describing the division and the conflict in the north of Ireland. His line, where bad news is no longer news, show how awful things must have been when it becomes normal. It is not news anymore, but instead a part of life. Polarization and long-standing hate, yet I live here too, I sing. There is an escalation in the hate, and it is surrounding everyone, and there is no escape. The little voices of those who lived there were lost. Oh, it's disgraceful. Surely I agree. Where is it going to end? It's getting worse. They're murderers. Internment. Understandably. The voice of sanity is getting hoarse. Heaney is talking about how there is no such thing as reason anymore. People are becoming increasingly violent and things are not getting any better. Religion's never mentioned here, of course. You know them by their eyes, and hold your tongue. Religion and politics are so interwoven in Ireland. They are both topics that should never be discussed, which is something that not only Dr. Murphy mentioned to us, but also locals. It is a topic that is held so close to people and their identity, so to avoid any violence, you never mention it. Northern reticence, the tight gag of place and times, yes, yes, of the wee sticks I sing. Where to be saved, you only must save face, and whatever you say nothing. Violence and death is the inheritance in the past, present, and seemingly future. I think Heaney is trying to say that those in the north are divided and they are stuck. The only way to avoid violence, hate, and discrimination is to say nothing. This poem was very emotional and sad, and I thought that Heaney did an excellent job at showing his own feelings of the times, as well as the general feeling of those who lived in the North. Heaney's poem did an excellent job at describing how the division created such hate and such violence, and how much of an impact it had on everyone's lives. It is hard to just pick up and move on from this, and that is why I think these statues are symbols of hope for the future. Hope that one day there will be peace and harmony throughout Ireland, both within and among the North and the South. When the guys on the Black Taxi tour were talking to us about the divisions and about the peace wall and how it would come down eventually, but Belfast was not ready quite yet, they seemed hopeful that one day Belfast would be ready and the peace wall would be taken down. I think that is how many Irish feel and why these statues are so important. They represent hope for the future and hope for peace. This statue was commissioned first by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland to be used in the sculpture park of Riddle Hall, but then in 1999 the Langside Corporation bought the statue and placed it where the old sheep and cattle market used to be. Again, like most of the statues and artistic pieces throughout Ireland, this statue is a monument to the past, but I found its placement interesting. Although it was placed there to be a visual link to the history of Ireland, I thought it was interesting how it was right beside a building that represented Belfast today. The statue reminded me of The Hill Bachelors by William Trevor. The character of Polly is stuck on a farm while his brothers and sisters move out into the city and progress into more modern careers and lives with their families. Like the statue next to the building, the story gives contrast between the way things used to be and how things are now. While Polly, Mr. Hartigan, and the rest of the Hill Bachelors continue to work on their farms, the rest of the world moves on and leaves the farming life behind. Like the placement of the statue, I thought that the story showed the changes in society and what they valued as ways of life. The women in Polly's life all keep leaving the small town. None of these Irish women want to be farm wives anymore. That is not what they value. Just like the cattle and sheep market was no longer valued as a way to make money. This mix between the new and the old can be seen all over Ireland. New buildings beside old ones, myth mixed with contemporary meaning, and games like Hurley having so much historical meaning and yet still being so important today. All this contrast between the past and modern times shows the progression and growth of Irish culture. After having endured so much, they have pushed through and been able to grow. The contrast within the story was shown also through the comparison of Polly and his siblings. They all lived in big cities and had kids and careers. They had no intentions to stay longer than was necessary. They were very different from Polly, and I think they contrasted the new and modern lifestyle next to the old farming lifestyle nicely. Besides just showing progression and change within Ireland, I also thought that wanting this statue here to represent what the area was in the past showed Ireland's attachment to their land and the old ways of working as farmers. I think that the Irish hold on tight to their roots and their past, and it is such a big part of their identity because they were dependent on their land and their roots for so long. This is shown in Trevor's story through how easy it was for Polly to transition into this lifestyle. It was as if he had never been away. He went about his daily tasks knowledgeably and efficiently. Although Ireland has grown considerably, the Irish will always have a strong hold on their roots and their past because it has been what has helped them to survive through so much. The reasoning behind the statue and its placement, I thought, told both these stories very well. Whether it was emigrants trying to escape the famine, relief ships coming to bring food to those in need, the shipping of convicts to Australia, or cruise ships coming to dock there, ships have always been a large part of Cobe's history. Even today, there are cruise ships that come and dock at this harbor. The statue to me symbolizes a deity protecting those who ship out from this harbor. He's holding them in his hand, protecting them in a way, watching over them. The moth on his back symbolizes the migration of the emigrants and the deity knowing the way there and the way back. The sagnet at the bottom of the statue is a navigation tool, and like the moth, I think that it symbolizes the deity being able to help the ships and navigate them so they do not get lost. In the Cope Heritage Center, there was a plaque that discussed an American wake and how it came from an Irish tradition of watching the dead. The American wake was celebrated the night before the emigrants left for America because the likelihood of them returning home or seeing anyone again was very slim. After those emigrating left, it was almost as if they were dead to those back home. The short story Going into Exile by Liam O'Flaherty is an example of this. The story, I thought, described perfectly the feelings that those leaving and those staying would have in this situation. He describes the night perfectly when he says that in spite of the music and dancing, there was a haunting melancholy in the air. People are trying to be joyous and happy, but all the while there is a constant worry and sadness about the loss of those who are emigrating. Far over the sea they will be carried, and that is a scary thought. I think that it is this thought that a lot of those emigrating had, and that is the reason behind the moth and the signet on the statue. It is a comfort, a way of saying that they will find their way and get there safely. Through all that I learned at the museum about those who emigrated through choice or through force, it is obvious that many families were broken up, and conditions on the ships were often horrifying, with many diseases and viruses breaking out. In a way, I feel this statue, although created years after many of this, was meant for those who emigrated and for their families. It is a comfort to know that those leaving are being looked over and will be able to find their way and make it to their destination safely. All these public art pieces stand for something. They tell the story of the area they were placed in and the people who lived there. I really appreciated being able to learn so much about Ireland through its art. The Irish truly are a culture who love to tell stories, and with such creative artists like Walsh, Kindness, and Heron, and many others, they are able to tell their stories in very unique ways.